It's the 4th era of Nern, into the 3rd century. It's been over 200 years since the last Dragonborn Emperor, Martin Septim, sacrificed himself to close shut the doors of oblivion, stopping Meru's Dagon forever. Since that day, the Empire has suffered. A far-right political group called the Falmor took over the Somerset Isles, creating the Old Mary Dominion. The Dominion believed that all elves should hold power in the world, and took advantage of the end of the Oblivion Crisis by using the lies of saying that it was the Falmor who closed the Oblivion Gates. Taking advantage of their rise to power, they begin invading parts of Tamriel, while the Empire begins to fracture. Needing guidance and influence, a new emperor is crowned, Titus Mede, who would lead the Empire in a war with the Dominion. The war would be costly for both sides, leading to the signing of the White Gold Concordat, the Empire taking the short end of the stick when it came to the negotiations. One of the main things that was enforced was the banning of the worship of Talos. Talos is the god of man, who thousands of years ago, as the Dragonborn Emperor Tiber Septim, used a great machine called the Numidium, powered by the heart of a god, the heart of Lorcan. With this machine he brought the whole of Tamriel to its knees, and when Tiber Septim died, it is said from all the souls he absorbed, it brought him to the status of godhood, making him Talos. Though because of that day, the High Elves hated the idea of a mortal man becoming a god. This, however, is a condensed version of the history and story that now leads us to the story of Skyrim. The region of Skyrim is caught in the midst of a civil war. After the death of High King Torygg by the hands of Ulfric Stormcloak in a duel, his death would split the region in two, one side backing the Empire and the other half backing Ulfric Stormcloak. Now that that's out of the way, what is a fort? A fort is a defensive building used to house soldiers, usually designed to hold a strategic position and defend the borders and the land they are built on. A good example of this is when William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings and was crowned King of England. The first thing he had to do was maintain order fast. Being a Norman and not Saxon, he had to show the people of England that his rule was absolute. So to do this, he erected motte and bailey castles. These were large muddy hills with a wooden castle built on top of it, with the surrounding of wooden stakes called palisades. These were designed to tower over towns and villages. These were only temporary, for they were of course made of wood and would be burnt down. So moved to the building of castles made of stone, to really hammer home that this is forever. Though a better example would be the Roman Empire's forts. Many were built on the borders of Gaul to Germania, with the continuous border wars with the Germanic tribes, as well as England, with great Roman forts to house the legionaries in York and Chester. Again, this was a way to hold control of the regions they were occupying or defending from the external threats. So the forts in Skyrim, there are quite a few of them scattered about the land, and many show the signs of age, for many of these forts were built hundreds of years ago during the long reign of the Empire, and some have seen better days and need repairs. These forts are scattered about to mark out the holds' borders with each other, as during the Great Nordic Empire each hold would have fought against one another. But because of the civil war in Skyrim, these forts are beginning to find their uses again, but mainly from the bandit tribes that are taking advantage of the division of the land. The first fort we will be looking at is the Fort Sungard, located on the eastern edges of the Reach, high upon the cliffs watching over the borders of Whiterun and Falkreath holds. This fort was clearly designed to watch over the roads, but also as a defensive position to fight against the tribes of the Reach, the Forsworn. So from the road we can see the fort looming overhead, its high towers and walls watching the roads of the area. The first thing of notice is the choke point that overlooks the unmarked pathway. The path itself is very narrow, meaning if you wanted to pass troops through it, you would have to contend with missiles and stones falling from the cliffs. Though the one thing that doesn't feel right is the idea of transporting supplies to the fort. You could argue that the supply carts parked down at the bottom of the road and the soldiers would have to carry the supplies up to the fort, but I feel that that would make things difficult. Though you could argue that a horse and cart could travel up this tight path. It might also be difficult too, depending on the size of the carts. So as we arrive to the outer walls, we see the wooden spiked barricades creating a tight pathway if invaders were to attack the fort. A wooden watchtower stands watching the pathway. This would be used to post a sentry to watch for attackers or soldiers needing to be posted. Also, there are 2 stables posted outside the walls, either used to house the officers' horses or the horses used to move supplies. The outer walls are aged, covered in a light moss, and also shows disrepair. The left-hand wall looks to have collapsed from time or from attacks in the past. We can see the piles of rubble from where the wall or possible extension tower that would shadow over the pathway, probably why there is a sentry platform placed down on the ground. We can see that the arched gateway has no gate to keep intruders out, which shows how long this conflict with the Civil War has been going on, or maybe it could be that this fort has not been used by the Legion or Stormcloaks because the bandits who held it have not had the materials or time to make necessary repairs. Entering the fort, we can see that time has taken its effect on the fort from the parts of the causeway are beginning to sink and the misalignment, probably from continuous weather erosion in the soil from the cold and rain over the years. Higher up on the causeway, we can see more of the disrepair, with the rubble of the upper floor collapsed either from erosion of time or from attacks in the past. It's very clear though that a heavy object had struck it, either from a projectile from a catapult or trebuchet, or perhaps destruction magic. To the left is a supply cart where the soldiers are in the process of unloading their supplies, and to the right is a small open shelter. I guess because of the climate of Skyrim, you can keep vegetables outside because of the coldness of the temperature. So moving under a small bridge, we make it to Fort Sungard's muster, where the troops are stationed and sleep and eat when they are to change shifts with their fellow soldiers. Entering the muster or the barracks, we can see a row of tables in front of us, as well as a ladder that leads up to the upper floor of the fort, where soldiers could muster forth if battle was called for. Down the stairs we find where the food is stored and prepared. Kitchen counters lie in the middle of the room, and barrels of vegetables and salt are sitting in a corner, while a fire blazes, keeping warm a cooking pot, where the Legion's food would be cooked in bulk to feed the soldiers. Leaving the kitchen, we go down some stairs to find where all the cutlery is stored, as well as a sewer grate filled with water, though when we leave through the grate, there is no water leaving it, as it's stuck out like 2 meters off the ground. This is a serious security risk, considering if someone who has knowledge of the fort and wanted to send off a small squad of soldiers to attack its sleeping defenders and then take the walls while no one was paying attention, it would be a serious security risk. Heading back to the main floor, we go down a corridor where 8 beds stand against the hallway's walls. I would argue that it would make more sense that these were bunk beds, but considering in real life bunk beds were invented in the 15th century and the fantasy genre of the Elder Scrolls is all over the place in its designs, we will say it's more of a game design thing. At the end of the hallway is the armory where all the weapons and armour are stored, though I would argue the weapons and armour are very randomised. Instead of being things you would see the Legion use in their fights, but it's because this is the gear that is in the fort when you attack the Forsworn holding the fort. But anyway, it's gear for the Legion if they need it. Also, cool little detail is the chests next to the beds has Imperial gear inside them, so it's a nice detail. So you can imagine when the soldiers get up from bed, they would go into the chest, put on their gear, and go off to do their 9 to 5. Heading up the ladder, we make it to the upper high walls. You leave through a trapdoor, and you get a great view of a lot of the area. Archers would have a great time picking off enemies from the road. It would be a painful time for an encroaching army to attack from the holds of Whiterun and Falkreath. And again, if enemies attacked from the gate, you could place your archers and fire down upon them. We can see the rubble from past conflicts. We can tell this rubble is created from past conflicts, and not from the erosion of weather or the decay of time, from these burnt wooden planks trapped between piles of rubble. A thing that confuses me is these small standing pillars It could be possible a long time ago, before the fort needed repairs. It could have been a small sheltered roof that would be used to stop volleys of arrows hitting the defenders, but also as a way to shelter the soldiers from the elements, which would be needed in a place like Skyrim. Finally, before we move on through the fort, something you would need of great importance is the lit braziers, which stand high on a pillar, one to keep the soldiers warm during the night, but also used to guide people travelling the road at night so they would be guided to their destination. And finally, to light arrows on fire to shoot pitch and tar and oil if invaders were to attack. However, I can see no fire pots or oil anywhere in the fort. Circling the high wall watching over the road, we can see the age of the fort and the past battles from the damage from the siege equipment projectiles. Getting to the end of the wall, we see a ring of pillars, which maybe a long time ago, a roof with a vent for the smoke would filter through, would stand on top of the pillars. This would be used for the soldiers who spent their time off praying to their gods. For the building next door to these pillars is named Fort Sungard Shrine. Before we go inside, we look out towards the T-junction, where a soldier on watch can see who is coming and going from the halls of Falkreath. Before we enter the shrine, I would like to point out the silly AI pathing of the soldiers in this fort. While writing this script, one of the Imperial soldiers kept standing in the brazier and burning to death 3 times. I used the resurrect command and they did it again and again. Guy just wants to be out of the Legion for good, it seems. Anyway, entering the shrine, we see the shrine of Akatosh with a great Imperial banner behind it. Roman forts, for example, would have had a small temple where they would pay tribute to their gods to look for guidance and understanding. Crusader castles during the Crusades in the Holy Land would have had churches or chapels where they would pray, especially on Sundays, which were holy days. I think it is safe to say that one way or another, any fort or castle would have had places of worship. In the Elder Scrolls, each god is given tribute. You will always find some small trinket that would be given at the base of the small statues throughout the world of Skyrim, though I imagine the forts will be different considering the soldiers there will not be carrying valuable items, only what they need on their campaigns. Beneath the shrine shows the evidence of where they would keep their dead to be prepared for burial, with empty coffins and straw to be used to add to the insides of the coffin, so if a soldier would fall in battle, they can be moved to a shrine, given the honours and respect a soldier would deserve before being shipped out of the fort to their destination to where they would be buried. Finally, leaving the shrine and heading to the highest wall of the fort, we can see the true extent of how damaged this fort is. With the sinking ground that has made the walls collapse downwards, it could be a long time ago that an earthquake or landslide from heavy rains made the walls and the soil collapse downwards. I would like to think that a long time ago this was once a storeroom or prison, which makes sense as you would want to keep the prisoners deep inside the fort, but because of the great collapse from the earthquake or landslide, this former building is now gone. Great piles of rubble are now scattered about the base of the surrounding walls. It would seem long ago that the walls would have connected together, creating a square shape. Leaving this behind, we now enter the annex. Ahead of us, we see a fireplace, and as we look up, we can see the connecting chimney where the smoke would be vented out of the room. However, what is missing is the detail of the ending of the chimney outside the building, though there is a fire blazing brazier with smoke coming out of it. Now you could argue this was a developer oversight and could have easily have been replaced with a chimney of sorts, but it does ruin the detailing a little bit. I mean, if you are going to create a fire and make the details of where the smoke would vent out into the world, why not make a chimney? But regardless, let's say for the sake of arguing, it's meant to be the connecting end of the chimney. Anyway, back inside the annex, we can see the entrance feels like a hastily used storage room, with the archery targets stuffed in a corner and a cart filled with weapons and shields. Going swiftly down the stairs, we can see a large jail cell, probably hastily built in the annex after the original jail was destroyed during the collapsing of the ground it stood upon. Now, I would like to add that this is where things get a little complicated for me. As we travel further down the stairs, there are 2 doors. On the left is where the commander of the fort is stationed, and this is where my disbelief takes hold. He would not want to put the commander's room anywhere near the position of the prison, because what if during the night the prisoner escapes their cell and creeps down the stairs to the commander's room and kills them? It would leave the whole fort in disarray. Not very smart thinking. However, what I do like is the detail of the many scrolls laid out on the table, which would be important for the commander to write out details and information for the runners to be sent out to the other holds or forts, or even to be sent back to Cyrodiil. And a commander would have such authority to do so, being the head of the legionary fort. However, what I do like is the detail of the many scrolls, as well as the book named Mixed Unit Tactics, to show the intelligence and importance of being prepared for battle. A good commander or leader must always have the knowledge and intelligence to lead soldiers into battle. A good example of a good military leader in real life was Major Winters of the 506th Infantry Regiment within the 101st Airborne Division. During the 2 years of his training and preparing for what was to come, he would often spend time reading and learning historical battle tactics in the libraries, because in his head he knew what was to come and he would need to be prepared and ready for battle, not just for himself but also for the soldiers he would lead in battle. This would ring true during the Second World War. Leaving the commander's room, taking the door on the right, it leads out to an open balcony, looking out towards the edges of the Reach's hold, and looks far beyond the Whiterun hold. Here a forge, workbench and grindstone would lay on the balcony, where weapons and armour would be made and repaired if needed during the Legion's campaigns. My only problem is the forge has no covering roof to keep away the weather. The worst thing for a forge is for the elements to keep putting out the fires, and you will always need to keep it hot and burning. Regardless, it is a very beautiful and scenic view. Now leaving the annex and entering Fort Sungard's tower, climbing all the way to the top of the tower, we get a fantastic view of the whole area. The importance of the towers in the fort were used to watch over the land, so you could get a bird's eye view of the land. It would alert the soldiers of the fort of the encroaching armies from a distance. I also like the details the tower has of the merlons, which are raised upright blocks of stone where the defenders of the battlement can take cover during a battle. Leaving behind the tower, we enter an open area leading to a lonely tower, which also gives us a dark story behind this fort. For this is no ordinary tower, it is an oubliette. An oubliette is a dungeon, used during the medieval times where prisoners are sent to be forgotten, where the most gruesome tortures are done, and after the information is gathered, if there ever was any information to gather, for people who delve into such sadistic methods, they are then thrown through a trapdoor at the bottom of the dungeon to either die or be forgotten. A gruesome detail I noticed was a piece of iron burning away on the fire, showing that when I took the tower from the Forsworn, they were going to use this iron to injure someone, and when we travelled down to the bottom of the tower we see the trapdoor, where at the bottom of the trapdoor we can see the body of a dead orc bandit, and many skeletons scattered about the floor, though the interesting thing to me is the 4 broken pillars scattered about with big wooden beams on the ground, and it makes me wonder what it was. Maybe a long time ago it was where the prisoners were placed in the deep caves, chained up in the deep darkness to be forgotten, though I see no shackles or chains in the rubble. But it has clearly been a long time since this room has seen some use. It might also offer the information of maybe the earthquake that brought the upper walls in Fort Sungard down. I will take a wild guess that it was the eruption of Red Mountain back in the 5th or 6th year of the 4th era that caused this damage, and the spreading magnitude damaging a lot of the forts in Skyrim. Fort Sungard certainly is a wonderful defensive fort and has a lot of great details behind its history, but it is also a good metaphor for the collapse of the strength of the Empire's hold on Tamriel. That the death of Martin Septim and the fall of the Blades and the rise of the Dominion has left a lot of the safety nets of Skyrim to wither and collapse. Now moving on to our next fort in the Gerald Mountains, past the Pale Pass, east of Falkreath, is Fort Neugrad, nestled high in the mountains. This fort feels isolated in its positioning, for from the paths to get to the fort itself seems to be used to guard the way to Cyrodiil and for those to enter Skyrim. From the state of the fort is in need of great repairs, showing that the Empire has really suffered in its ability to maintain these necessary forts, for the land of Skyrim is a hostile place to live in, and you would need to pay the upkeep of these forts to maintain them. For example, in English history, during the English Civil War, the Royalists used Pontefract Castle as a mainland defensive position. The Royalists held the castle for 2 months, but would soon surrender it to the parliamentarians after being continuously besieged. After the execution of Charles I, Parliament would agree to have the castle destroyed. The reason for its destruction was because it was better that the castle would be destroyed, as the cost of repairs would be too much, but also so that if there was a chance of another civil war, this castle would be the thorn in the side to the parliamentarians, and it would be better also to use the stone from the castle to repair the infrastructure of the country after a very damaging war. So looking at the fort, it is clear that Falkreath Hold, or the Empire in general, has really cut on the cost on repairs for the fort. On the surrounding area are low dug-in palisade walls to deny entry inside the fort, when originally the surrounding of the fort would have had stone walls to keep out invaders. It is clear this fort has seen its fair share of past conflicts. It could have been that during the First War with the Dominion that they tried to enter Skyrim but were completely held off by the Nords, though there is no clear evidence to say that was so. But a better example might have been during the Oblivion Crisis, when Oblivion gates were opening across all of Tamriel, and it is clear to see the fort has seen better days. And for the Civil War, Falkreath Hold is doing its best to maintain control of its region. Where the palisade walls are, small wooden bridges are used to connect the crossing together. Even in the gap of the wall, the defenders have had to use wooden planks to seal the gap to make sure no one during an attack would fall over. Clearly, because of the amount of time that has gone by with the snow and ice, it would have taken its toll on the stone eroding it over time. In science and nature, when you apply water to a stone and then freeze it over a long period of time of melting and then freezing, the stone will begin to erode from the continuous times of water freezing and melting. So looking at the wall's causeway, it would have fallen apart very slowly over time. Behind the fort is a small in-mountain lake that would clearly be useful for the defenders of the fort. Attached to the side of the lake is a dock with a boat where I imagine the soldiers would use the lake for fishing and also retrieving fresh mountain water to supply the fort. Though this in-mountain lake does show a design flaw for the fort, as if there was someone who had information of the design and the layout of the fort, they would know that there is a hidden entrance into the prison from the lake, and if there was a person or group daring enough to swim inside the cave, they could free any prisoners or attack the fort under the cover of darkness and take the fort without anyone being the wiser. Of course, this would have to be believable that you had a group of soldiers who could swim or even hold their breath for long enough to get into the fort from the lake. Back to the exterior of the fort, we can see 2 towers that look out towards the road. One of the towers still standing tall over the area, so it's very useful for the archers or sentries to watch the road for possible invaders into the hold of Falkreath. Meanwhile, the second tower is shattered and broken at points, leaving only one side standing. Thankfully, it is still standing strong to deny entry of enemy invaders. From the looks of things, it was struck from siege engines like catapults or trebuchets from the road going towards Helgen, or better yet, destruction magic mages. And going back to the cost of repairing a fort, it would cost too much to repair, so it was just left as it is. I also believe that because of the War of the Dominion and the Civil War, it set back focus on repairs from the cost of the war effort. Just like Fort Sungard, the main gateway is missing a gate from stopping any enemies from entering its interior. But what I find fascinating, as not even a few meters of the first gateway is another gateway. So it is clear to see that this fort was designed to deny attackers from a clear entrance into it. If we take an aerial shot, we can see that the second gateway had a second wall that would have connected to the exterior walls, but because of the attack in the past, part of the wall is now missing, so the soldiers have created a ramp with a palisade wall surrounding it, which makes me question why they would do this instead of just creating a full palisade wall on the whole surrounding to make sure there is limited entry points into the fort, which is a bit of a security risk. Now there is something I do like, and it's a little jab on something I pointed out too at Fort Sungard earlier, and it's the outdoor forge that had no cover from the elements. Well, Fort Neugrad has its forge, workbench and grindstone in a little barn with air vents to let the smoke escape. This meets the Rising Fawn approval, as again you would want to keep your forge out of the elements, especially in the Gerald Mountains where you would need to keep the forge hot from continuous cold and snow. We can also see a few small braziers and a fire inside the courtyard of the fort, which would be very important to keep your soldiers warm, otherwise they would freeze to death, though I would argue there are not enough of them. If you expect your soldiers to stay outside in the freezing cold, you would expect to have lit fires to stand by, though you can argue these are Nordic forts, and the Nords are a hard people to have a great resistance to the cold. A fire goes a long way. Not just for the heat, but for keeping up morale. Now on top of the main keep of the fort are two fully lit beacons. I would imagine their purposes were for creating light in the night, that if anyone was travelling at night, they would be able to see where they are going. But I also have an additional theory for the purposes of these two beacons, were to always continuously keep burning, and by doing so, I like to think inside the pillars they stand on, they would vent heat through the fort, keep it insulated and warm from the harsh colds of Skyrim. Of course, that is just a theory. Maybe a his or her historian could tell me if there was ever such a thing, or a developer in Bethesda who designed these beacons would be able to tell me the purpose for them. Please, pretty please. In the main courtyard is the stables where the horses would be kept. There is only one horse in the stables, so this could be the officer's horse who had the money and status to have a horse, or this is a horse for the messengers to muster forth to deliver letters to the other holds. We also can see two archery targets, where the soldiers can practice to hone their skills on the days where they have time off, and on the table are a couple of bows and arrows. Maybe unwise to keep wood out in the cold elements, especially when you want your equipment to be in good condition before a battle, or to practice with, and the wood will warp in the cold. Clearly the Stormcloaks don't get inspections. Next to the archery range is a well that is covered in wooden planks, probably hastily put together with how infrequent the fort is occupied. Of course you would want to cover over your well to make sure the water is not in the elements and safe from contamination. I would like to think this is an artesian well, which is a well that is dug into the earth to pull groundwater from the deep inside the earth, and especially when you have a natural in-mountain lake right next to the fort, it would be possible the well feeds from the mountain river channels. Now entering the prison, we see an open room, a fire burning on the left, which would be necessary to keep the prison warm from the outside elements. Beside the fire is a pile of timber logs to keep the fire burning, and next to them is a shovel, probably to be used to shovel coal into the fire, which is probably why there are a few unmarked barrels next to the entrance. There are two guards in this prison. One who sits close by the entrance, keeping watch on the door, but also watching the fire to keep it burning during the cold days and night. In one of the rooms we find a bookshelf and a table where the guards could do some light reading to keep entertained. One of the books sitting on the table is, of note, a note of the Oblivion Crisis, which I find curious because it was earlier in the video I noted that I wondered if this fort would have seen action during the Oblivion Crisis. So just a small curiosity that a book on that very subject would be sitting on this table. Now this prison has a gruesome detail, where prisoners would be held in tight captivity. We can also see the use of piles of hay to capture the blood from the captors from when they are clearly being tortured for information. Now swiftly going down the stairs we find a few empty cells and the second guard sitting on duty, though I would argue what is the point of a second guard being in the area of empty cells? Or could it be because at the bottom of the prison is a storage room filled with barrels of alcohol, and the second guard takes cheeky trips down to the bottom cave cellar and takes a few drinks while no one is watching? I also do find it weird that you would keep your drinking provisions in the prison cave cellar, or better yet to keep a cave cellar with an open pool to swim out of into the outside of the fort. Quite a security risk, though we can see the guards have put traps down to give warning to anyone that an intruder is breaking in. Anyway, back to the room with the cells. We can clearly see this prison needs some serious repairs, as the pillar in the centre of the room is crumbling in the middle and is being held together by makeshift beams. And if these beams collapse, the entire first floor of the prison will fall apart. Again, it really shows the cost and effort of maintaining a fort or castle. Now entering the main keep of Fort Neugrad, we can see a great open feasting hall with many different doors heading off into different directions. The main feasting hall is filled with tables and benches and chairs, with all manners of food and drinks to keep a garrison fed and happy. One thing I do find a serious risk to the whole garrison inside the keep is the many fire hazards lying about the area. You have candles in close proximity to flags, and all it would take is one bad breeze when someone opens the door to the keep during a blizzard to catch the flags on fire. We also have a small brazier burning on a wooden countertop, also in close proximity to a flag. Double fire hazard. I for the life of me have no clue who thought that was a good idea. Moving on to the room to the right, we find the armory and the room the soldiers can test their skills against the practice dummies. Many different weapons lie about upon the tables and racks in the room. I also like that there is a tiny keg in the room so the soldiers can have a drink to stay hydrated after honing their fighting skills, as well as a potion of stamina to reduce the fatigue from their training. Now heading up to the upper floor, it overlooks the feasting hall. One has a corner where someone can sit and read a book for some solitude after a long day. Heading through the door on the right, we can see many beds laid about where the soldiers can sleep. The fireplace sits in the main part of the room, intended to keep away the chill of the cold. Timber lies on the left and right sides of the fireplace, so the fire can always be kept burning through the day and night to always keep the heat in the fort. Leaving the bedrooms through a small hallway, we can see that there is a workbench and grindstone and a few weapons laid about likely to be repaired or sharpened. I would argue putting the workbench and grindstone so close to the bedrooms would be an absolute pain to live with if you are trying to get a few hours of sleep. But let's just argue that the fort has a good scheduling system. Linking to the highest point of the keep is a ladder, and if we can take it, we see a few beautiful views of the whole area. We can even walk across the beacon's rooftops. I don't know why, but I'd like to think you get a very pleasant warmth flowing through the stone when you walk across the roof of these beacons. But it still gives me pause in if these beacons bring heat to the inner keep. I can also see from the view of the keep the in-mountain lake's water flows to the left, as if it is draining off into a subterranean river channel, or underground channel if not to be too technical. Now going back inside the keep, taking the hallway to where the fort's commander would sleep, though I could not find throughout the whole fort a single commander of the camp. Though a soldier sits at their table, it must have been an oversight from the developers. I also noticed there is a missive where information of an incoming Imperial force is close at hand and could threaten the hold over the fort, though I see no quill or ink pots or even parchments to write on for the commander to write out information or detailing their stay at the fort. Going back down to the fort floor, we enter the kitchen area, where I imagine the cook must have a drinking problem as there are so many bottles of wine lying about the table. But I like that there is a rabbit hanging near the fire to be prepared for cooking, as well as barrels of vegetables to be added to the cooking pot for the stew that is to be prepared. In the medieval times, the cooking pot would always be cooking on the fires of the cooking pit or fireplace. This would make sure the food would never go off, with the high temperature of the food always boiling away. Now finally going back into the feasting hall and taking the door that leads down into the lower basement of the keep, and this seems to be more of a quiet area filled with books and a few tables, where the soldiers can simply have some peace and quiet. And that was Fort Neugrad. It's quite a fascinating fort in a very peaceful part of the Skyrim, but also one of the most important locations with it guarding the Pale Pass. So the Imperials would want to have the area free of intrusion and be guarded so their soldiers can pass into Skyrim without any threats, while the Stormcloaks would want it to stop the Empire being supplied by troops from the Pale Pass from Cyrodiil. So to finish my video, I will be having a quick look at Fort Greenwall. Located deep in the Reach, north of Riften, it guards the main road towards Riften. This is a strange looking fort, because it has realistic added parts, but also parts that feel like a silly design detail. So on the outer part of the fort, we can see the walls are built on a hillock on one side. I like to think that this was a Motte and Bailey based fort once upon a time, with a tower built on top of it. Then over time, the walls were built around the hillock and dug into the ground, and then extended parts of the fort were added far later. But this in lies a problem with the fort. You see, they dug into the hill, but never uprooted the growing trees on top of the hillock, which then causes problems with the foundations. As you can clearly see, the inside of the fort has collapsed walls and ceilings, as well as the stretched out roots on the ceiling would cause major structural damage, because all it would take is the roots to cause a collapse of the whole ceiling, and anyone inside would be crushed underneath it. Now this is a real detail in life. Tree roots are extremely strong and can cause structural issues if not attended to. So the idea that the Nords dug into the hillock, built their fort around and in the inside of it is crazy. I could imagine a structural engineer losing their mind at this site. Still, I love the look of the area. It's peaceful and surrounded by mountains and trees. The rift always has that autumn feeling to it, with colours of the leaves. I don't know how to end the video, but I will say I do love the look of the forts in Skyrim. The only thing I would say is I wish there were different designs for the fort's towers, instead of the circular design, and I tried looking for history on the forts, but sadly I could not find any, as I would have used some in-game book quotes. Anyway, in real life history of castles, there have been many different kinds of towers that were made, and as time moved on, castle walls and their towers changed because of the changes of siege warfare and the flaws in their original designs. I just wish there were more details to the forts in the game. It would really create more realism to these lived-in fortifications. Like, I want to know the history of these forts, why they were built, but sadly there is no such luck. Regardless, I love this game, even though at times its storytelling is very surface level and lacks layers. But that will be the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more videos in the future. I'm the Rising Fawn, take care and good night.